excellent talk.
Lovely, thanks to both. Okay, so our penultimate speaker tonight is Dr. Mariecia Fraser from the Institute of Biological, Environmental and Rural Sciences at Aberystwyth University. Mariecia is a reader in upland agroecosystems. She has a background in animal and grazing ecology and specialises in developing and testing management strategies for upland systems. Her research interests include species and breed differences in diet selection and ingestive behaviour, conservation grazing, nutrient supply from forages, greenhouse gas emissions from grazing animals, and the bioenergy potential of semi-natural grasslands. She's worked with a range of animal species and pasture types, as well as fresh and ensiled alternative forages to deliver a range of products such as meat, fibre, habitats and biorenewables. So with that, I will hand over to Dr. Fraser and thank her for her attendance this evening.
Thank you very much, Hazel, and thank you very much to the organisers for the opportunity to join us this evening and talk a little bit about our research. So I'm going to talk about grasslands, and what I'm going to be focusing on is the upland grassland system. So this talk very much complements what you've already heard from Sarah. So this little graphic just summarises the transition that we get in grassland type from the temporary grasslands, less than 5 years old, highly productive, through the permanent pastures to the semi-natural rough grazing. So we've got productivity higher on the left-hand side, whereas in terms of other public good delivery, that increases as we head to the right. So I'm going to be focusing on the permanent pasture, and these would normally be classified as more than 5-year-olds. But when it comes to upland pastures, a lot of the permanent grazing that we're looking at is maybe 30, 40, 50 years old. These are remnants from the last push for improved productivity in these areas back in the 70s. And so what are these other public goods? Biodiversity always springs to mind when talking about the environment. But we have to be aware that upland areas provide 70% of our drinking water. So we want to consider water supply, but we also want to think about water management and flood control. If the uplands are there and acting as a sponge, then when we think about some of the more erratic weather conditions that we're already beginning to see and which are forecast for the future, those extreme rainfall events, when they come, our upland areas can act as a sponge and help slow the flow to areas downstream. Carbon management is another increasingly important aspect, and it's easy to think about just the peatlands. I mean, they are our largest terrestrial source of carbon, more stored in the peatlands of the UK than the forests of UK and several other European countries combined. But our other soils can do a lot in terms of storing carbon as well. And recreation and tourism are important. These areas are used by a wide variety of people. So thinking about land use and in Wales in particular, you can see the importance of that permanent grassland. Huge chunk of Wales, around 2/3 is covered by that permanent grass. And we also then have a good area of rough grazing as well. So our research has been focused on ways to improve the sustainability of these two different grassland types. So moving on to one of the core programs that we have on at the moment. This is a whole research program around grassland and crops for challenging environments. So challenging environments, growing in the uplands it's a challenging environment for plants. The economic environment for farming is challenging and is like to get more challenging. And now we have to think about climate change and climate crisis and the changes that that's going to bring in our weather patterns. So why is this research needed? Well, there's a huge amount of excellent research goes on developing new varieties of grasses and clovers, other plant species. But the way they're tested really allows for their maximum productivity under ideal growing conditions. So the sites where the testing occurs are in lowland areas, very good growing conditions. When the varieties are tested, they're given the large amounts of fertilizer relative to what would be spread in the uplands. So the plants are given the opportunity to show what they can do under really good conditions, and there's no grazing. Grazing is simulated by cutting frequently. But what happens once you take these varieties, these plants up into the low fertility conditions that are typical of upland areas? In the past, when improvement happened, we relied on adding a lot of nutrients to these soils to try and convince these plants that they were actually growing in much better conditions than they actually were. But we need to reduce those inorganic inputs for financial reasons and for environmental reasons. So those are all reasons we need to think about what are the best varieties for these areas. Another aspect of the testing system is that the varieties are developed in isolation. Obviously, that makes the comparison between different varieties much easier, but given that they will ultimately be sown as part of mixtures, our understanding of the competition between different components within a mixture is pretty poor at the moment. And so we need to improve that. And together, if we look at these different aspects, hopefully we can improve our sward stability and also deliver multifunctional grasslands that are good for productivity, but also good for those public goods. So this is an example of the type of research that we have on the go at the moment. We've created a challenge gradient across 4 different sites, ranging from 70 meters above sea level. So those are very good growing conditions, some of the best in the county. We then go up through 150, 230 and 340 meters above sea level. So, and at each of those different steps, we get a greater challenge from the environmental conditions and also a reduction in the fertility of the soil and the quality of the soil. Across the sites, we've got a 2 to 3 degree difference in the temperature, and also, as you would expect with the west of Wales, quite a substantial change in the amount of rainfall. So we're working with 2 contrasting mixtures, one which with very ryegrass dominated would be expected to be a high performing mixture, and the other is much more species diverse and would be normally targeted at slightly poorer growing conditions where a longer life sward would be preferable. So on top of our different mixtures in our different sites, we're then imposing 4 different contrasting management regimes. We've got continuous grazing, so the pasture managed to best practice sward surface height. We've got rotational grazing on a 21-day rotation. We've got a 3-week cut, and this is equivalent then to the simulated grazing that's used for the national list testing. And we have a 6-week cut, or a conservation cut, again mimicking what would happen under testing, national list testing. And as part of the design, we've also included an area where we didn't actually sow any seeds. We're monitoring what's coming up from the seed bank, so we can understand the competition that the mixtures are being exposed to from that source as well. So we're currently just into the second of what will be ultimately a 4-year experiment. And understandably, the number of years for this type of work is important because each growing season is different. We've had wet weather, we've had dry weather. We need to be able to monitor how the different mixtures respond. But even without going into the detail of the data, it's fairly obvious. This is just midway through the first season last year. comparing there, it's just a photograph of the rotationally grazed versus the 3-week cuts, and really obvious difference there in the clover just through the heads being visible. There's an awful lot of data to come from this in terms of what's happening below the soil, as well as what's happening within the pasture, and looking at triggers for can we predict when individual components within that pasture are starting to struggle. I'm thinking here particularly of the forage legume component of some of the clovers. These are the things we start to lose from our mixtures because of the selective grazing by the stalk and the challenge in competing against grasses. Now, forage legumes have the potential to be an incredibly important component in upland swards. They deliver a lot of different benefits, although they are hard to maintain in these different pastures. They're high in protein. This little graphic here is summarizing what I'm saying, and it's basically using pluses, minuses, zeros to give an indication of the relative difference between the different forages and ryegrass at the end. So you can see that as far as protein is concerned, they're all delivering a higher nitrogen content, higher crude protein percentage in the pasture compared to ryegrass. In terms of where they can grow, white clover and red clover, very versatile. Lucerne, less so, same with sainfoin. Generally prefer alkali conditions, which is harder to find in upland areas. In terms of the protein digestibility, again, the white clover and the red clover, very good. Lotus caniculatus is that little bird's foot trefoil, little yellow flower. Protein digestibility and protein content of that, also very good. What we found in experiments comparing the nitrogen balance of animals fed these different forages is that when it comes to lucerne or alfalfa, the problem there is that the protein is extremely digestible. So unless you're very careful to balance that protein with an energy source, there's a real risk that it's lost from the animal in the urine. So there's an issue that has to be addressed there if you're going to get the most out of alfalfa. And then it also struggles with the soils. With sainfoin, we found a different issue with the protein being relatively indigestible. So a lot of the nitrogen that went in the front end of the animal was then being lost in the dung. As well as the protein content of forage legumes, another really important aspect of this group of plants is that some of them have that protein protected. So when the animal eats the herbage, instead of having the protein broken down in the rumen and then being made back up into microbial protein that's then digested, the plant protein bypasses all that and is used directly by the animal, which makes the system much more efficient. Red clover has an enzyme, polyphenol oxidase, which does this, and lotus and sainfoin both contain condensed tannins, which again do this. Some of those protein protection elements could also be at work in this when you're ensiling, as well as when the animals are grazing. So there's some real benefits to be had from that. When we've looked at animal performance, we found that the live weight gain higher for most of the forage legumes compared to grass, and particularly for the red clover and the lotus. I say performance on silage also very good. Environmental benefits, there's a whole host. There's that efficient use of the protein, so you're excreting less nitrogen. They're deeper rooting, so higher rainfall infiltration. And there's also an improvement in soil health in the bacteria within the soil as well. They're not relying on inorganic nitrogen, they're fixing their own nitrogen from the atmosphere, and they're making that available to the grasses and other plants alongside. So there's a lot of good reasons for trying to improve the legume component within our marginal swards. But how do the different varieties that are tested in the national list system compare once they're actually grown in these upland conditions, where the soils are poorer, the weather is harsher, both in terms of lower temperatures, lower shorter growing seasons, higher number of days of frost in the winter, a whole range of different things. Well, this is very initial data from experiments we've got on the go, looking at a range of different varieties, trialling Upland, not only trialling in upland conditions, but also with typical amounts of upland fertilizer inputs. So rather than the really high levels that the list testing would give them, we're giving them something that's representative of what's happening with the industry. The graphs I'm going to show are from our establishment at the end of our establishment year last year, and we're really only in the middle of the first full harvest year this year, and we really need to carry this on for another couple of years before we can produce anything conclusive from this. So for now, the varieties are just being left as numbers. I'm not going to say what varieties are what at the moment. But what I have done is starred the variety that's the oldest variety. And in the case of ryegrass, that's an extremely old variety. And a lot of you with connections to the uplands will be able to guess which particular variety that is. So in terms of ryegrass, we are getting some indications of variability. This is in terms of yield for that final cut. For white clover, a bit more of an indication, a bit more variation, but again, this is just the establishment year. And then for red clover, quite interesting that our oldest, very well established variety is the one that seems to be leading the charge with regards to the clovers at the moment. So within each of the different plant categories, the varieties we're testing are a mixture of these really well-established, well-known varieties and some really new materials. Some of the material hasn't even got a varietal name as yet. So there's more to come on that. And then once we've picked what we want to introduce to our pasture, we need to think about ways of doing this. Obviously, the technologies in terms of slot seeding versus broadcast seedings and different machinery is relatively well trialed, and people have experience of doing that sort of thing on their own farm. But something we were interested in looking at was whether there was a way of doing this without going down the route of heavy intervention and of taking big machinery onto some of these steeper slopes and more challenging areas where we maybe want to be a little bit more sympathetic about how we go about things. So we looked at a system where we used a renovation harrow, basically an ironbock, to clear the dead material and the moss that had built up at the base of the sward. So we compared that with the same renovation plus broadcast seeding with legumes. And we sowed a mixture of red and white clover where we were sowing the legumes. And we set this up over replicated plots. So this is a really straightforward system using equipment that would be available on many farms. And then this is a photograph just to give an illustration of the type of results we've had. These plots, most of them are part of a very long-term experiment that's been running for 25 years now, looking at the impact of different management regimes on upland permanent pasture. And the plot that's been highlighted there, this is one of our control plots, which has received lime regularly, P&K plus 60 kilograms of nitrogen a year for the last 25 years. These plots here, as part of that old experiment, they've now had 25 years of no fertilizer inputs. And where the 60 kilos of nitrogen per year might have been the industry standard when this experiment started, more and more of these permanent pastures are now receiving next to no fertiliser input. So we've had a bit of a shift to these plots here probably representing business as usual for a lot of areas. And these are our renovated plots. So we did the soil sampling, we lined, we brought the P&K status back up, but we're putting on either the 60 kilograms of nitrogen where there was no legumes, or just a small amount of nitrogen to get the legumes established where we were broadcast seeding. And we have got a lot of data for these plots and samples, but I think this photograph illustrates very nicely the impact that actually fairly simple, straightforward techniques can have in terms of improving the pasture. This is an relatively early spring photograph. You can see the response of those swards to the new management regime. So all these things that we're doing to improve nutrient supply, improve feed efficiency, they all help the overall health of the animal, improve its immune system, its health status. Improved efficiency means reductions in time to finish. All of this then helps us reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, particularly in terms of the methane emissions. The diagram on the right just summarises the UK agricultural sources for methane. And we can see that sheep and beef, which are the main livestock types within the uplands across the UK, certainly in Wales, they're a huge source and one of the main sources of methane. So anything that we can do to reduce that by improving efficiency is good for the industry and it's good for the environment. In addition to just the general improvements through more efficient systems, some of those legumes, the ones with the enzymes, the tannins, all those compounds also have another role to play in potentially reducing the amount of methane produced by the bacteria in the rumen. So there's a number of different ways that the feeding can complement what we heard about earlier from our first speaker with regards to the genetics. So there's a combination of fronts there which we can tackle the emissions from livestock systems. So I'm just going to move on now and say a little bit about our rough grazing areas. So these are areas which have not been improved. In the past, this may have been down to the fact they were very wet, very rocky, very steep. A lot of them are the real high ground that we find across the country. So in the past, we saw a problem emerge of serious overgrazing in some areas as a result of the headage payments and the increase in stock numbers. Partly that was just an increase in sheep numbers and also a reduction in the number of mixed farming systems. So it was lots and lots of sheep only. And we saw habitats being degraded. More recently, cap reform and decoupling has brought new issues with regards to undergrazing. So a lot of our habitats now suffer from a build-up of unwanted material, one or two plant species dominating, and that's led to a loss of habitat for different reasons. And so in more and more of these areas, conservation groups, land managers are having to actively try to reduce the cover of certain species and change the balance. This is a nice example. It's not from Wales, but you can see this sort of activity on hillsides around Wales during the summer. So the problem for Wales now isn't so much the number of sheep, but the problem still remains for Wales that we tend to have systems that are only grazed by sheep. And sheep aren't a problem. It's sheep on their own that's more of an issue. Any grazer where you've only got one type of grazer grazing there'll be limitations compared to mixed grazing systems. And that's why we've seen the move to encouraging cattle back up into these areas, And a lot of the work that we've done in the past, our research has been used to underpin the agri-environment schemes that have rewarded farmers for having cattle and then for grazing certain areas by the cattle. They go in, they clear a lot of this material just because they're less selective grazers, and their physical presence can make a difference as well. They open up the pasture, their trampling creates bare ground, and that just allows other species to come, plant species to come through. But despite all that, we know that a lot of the agri-environment schemes and the prescriptions have failed to deliver what we really want in terms of change. And part of that is because the livestock units and the prescriptions that are imposed are incredibly blunt. It's a really ineffective way of controlling what's going on. You're assigning a number of animals to areas that could be several hundred hectares in size and trying to predict what's going to happen with their grazing. So as part of our research more recently, we've been looking at ways of tracking the behaviour of the animals once they're in these big enclosures. This, being able to know where the animals are and what they're doing, has been a real limiting factor for research in the past. We've had to rely on fencing down to small enclosures to be able to collect the data we need, and then assume that that would be representative of what happens in a big area, which isn't necessarily the case. So one of our projects has been looking at radio tracking with ear tags, and then because you need then a receiver to pick up the ear tags, and we're talking about big areas, we've been looking at flying drones over the animals to collect the data, the signals on where the animals are. So the drone flies over, it sends out a signal. This is an example of the sort of ear tag we're looking at. This is a couple of inches long. It sends out a signal saying, yes, I'm here. And then by flying a pre-programmed grid over the area, we can triangulate where each animal is. And because the signals are different for each animal, we know exactly which animal is where. So we've been using that, plus mapping from putting a multispectral camera onto the drone as it flies over, to create this type of map. So this is a 200-hectare enclosure in the Upland Valley. And the goal of the prescription is, there's an area of blanket bulb which is located around here. What they want to do is reduce the cover of the purple moorgrass, the Mariecia, to allow the blanket bulb to recover. And so what they want is grazing to be happening in a lot of these areas where there is very little grazing pressure at the moment. The areas where the animals are focused on are areas where there was cutting, harvesting of the Mariecia some years ago, and the regrowth has come back through greener and more nutritious. And the sheep behaviour then drives them to grazing those parts of the paddock. So an easy win in this situation is to create more of these cut areas to draw the animals away from the area where we want the grazing pressure reduced, and to encourage them to then help get the ecosystem functioning again. Alongside the tracking technology, we've also been working to develop low-cost GPS collars. When the work started, the commercial products you could buy cost about £1,200, which, if you're working with sheep, is an awful lot of money given the price of an animal. And that tended to limit experimental work to just tracking a handful of animals and hoping that that was representative of the whole flock. So we've been developing a programmable system that costs around between £100 and £150, so we can collect data for many more animals. It's working for our understanding of how the animals are using the space, but we can also then start to look at things like proximity not only to understand their grazing behaviour, but potentially to look at issues with regards to health and disease transmission. Building on this initial work, been working with Caerphilly Council to set up systems where, as the animals access water troughs and feed troughs, then data is downloaded on their behaviour of the last 24 hours as a way of flagging up potential issues, trying to get to look for patterns in health and identify problems before they become a serious problem. So our work still focuses largely on cattle and sheep, but one of the things that would make a big difference to management of these areas were if within the new policies and the new programmes for sustainable farming and other agri-environment schemes across the UK, if those schemes recognised other grazers and other types of livestock. That would allow us to capitalise on the differences in grazing behaviour between these different species, and also allow the market to open up in terms of novel meat and fibre products. So we're already working, we've worked with some of these animals, plans to work with others, and with, again, just thinking about whales in particular, preserving rare populations, the likes of the Canidai pony, native ponies and their potential role in delivering ecosystem services is something that is now getting the attention it deserves, and hopefully we'll see that converted into some policies in the near future. So what happens when there are no grazers? Just thinking about these semi-natural communities. We've been working for a number of years now to explore whether that build-up of material that we get, often it's rank, very fibrous, often consisting of problem species like rush, bracken, or purple moorgrass. Can we use that as a feedstock for bioenergy? And through a number of different European projects, we've been working with partners, particularly in Germany, to develop the technologies that would allow us to do that. So the advantages here is that the cutting, which is already going on, it's producing hundreds and thousands of bales of material that, instead of just being discarded, could be used as an alternative fuel. That cutting is happening to improve biodiversity, so that's a byproduct of this particular type of fuel. And there's no need for this to compete with grazing. This could be integrated as part of a rotational system, which includes cutting and grazing, to give us that mosaic at a landscape scale, which delivers on habitat. So we've looked at a range of different processing options and producing different products. One that we're particularly interested in now, new work is starting, is biochar. So this is essentially charcoal. It's what you get when you burn material in the absence of oxygen. And there's two really quite exciting routes where biochar can make a difference to our systems. One is as a feed additive. There's some evidence, mostly from laboratory studies, that this feeding biochar as a supplement will reduce methane emissions from livestock. And then the other potential use of it is as a soil conditioner. And again, the evidence to date is that there's real potential for this to improve the quality of soils, particularly if they're low nutrient status and acidic soils, so which pretty much covers a lot of the upland soil conditions. So that's something else that we're working with now. So I'm going to finish there and just encourage you, if you want to keep up to date with these and other projects we've got on the go, then you'll find us on Twitter, and you'll find our Facebook page on the parent page has updates regularly on these and other projects, so you can find out what's happening as soon as it happens. Thank you.
Lovely, thanks Mariecia. Really interesting, really varied research, and again, please do assume that the round of applause was given despite the virtual silence. I've had a question come through on the chat. You've mentioned changes to CAP and obviously the shift towards public goods. Given this likely shift, what do you think is the future for upland farming in Wales?
Oh, I suspect if you asked 10 different people, you get 10 different answers on that one. I think if anybody had a crystal ball to be able to answer that question, they'd be extremely well off. We are facing potentially some major changes. There's real potential for this to benefit communities and the environment if it's done right, and I'm very much hoping that that will be the case. I think we're going to see a breakdown between the silos of farming and grazing and forestry, and this is just a nice segue into what Jim's going to talk about with agroforestry. The issue of where the trees go is going to be a major one. Given the incentives for tree planting, there's a real risk we lose a lot of our farmland to blocks of conifers. So that's something we need to avoid. I would like to also see, more variety in the livestock that we keep. We don't need to go to an extreme. There might be a place for some elements of rewilding in any landscape, but there's also space for more extensive, more naturalistic systems on some of these higher areas where we've lost our grazing. So yeah, it's very, very hard to say, and I hope we see change for the better, and we don't suffer some of the there's some pretty pessimistic scenarios out there which would be best avoided if at all possible.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think it is definitely unprecedented times at the moment.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you again. That was really interesting. And I'll now, given the time, without any further delays, hand over to Will for our last speaker's introduction. So thanks.